Elena, I think that you should take the floor, and I would like to start by reminding the audience what you used to say in 2009 when you said that the wrong diagnosis leads to wrong treatment. And nobody listened to you then, although you were close to the then Prime Minister and you had voiced your opinion in Parliament. Do you think that we still apply this wrong treatment? Yes, I do. And I'm happy that Mr. Floridis is here. I hope that he'll listen to me and perhaps, reiterate my opinion at Parliament. If you allow me, I'll try to walk around a little bit. I mean, we're going to be here for another 4 hours, so I'd like to stretch my legs. And I would like to ask my beloved Thanos to load the slides. I'm not going to use them all, but just have to have some visual material as we're discussing this. Because, we're discussing and in this country. So, why did we diagnose the crisis wrongly? Christophoros explained this very well, and Luca talked about this quite well. It was diagnosed wrongly because it was diagnosed by people in the banking sector and macroeconomists outside Greece. So both these, especially macroeconomists, all of us economists who have become economists in this period, the recent period from our PhD onwards. So we've learned to live and work in a world which is friction-free. So if I want to buy Technopolis, for example, because it's the first time I'm here and it's the first time that we organise this fantastic meeting and I like it. And, I know a couple of Greek Americans who want to invest in Greece. So, the economist will say, OK, it's bought. But what is this purchase based on? The macroeconomist will say that it's based on the fact that someone came, he liked it, someone else wants to sell it. So we have two people. And this is the result. The result of the purchase agreement is based only on the correct price, which essentially is a function of how much one party wants it and how much the other party wants to receive for it. So there are no other factors in this transaction, but there are other things here. And what are they? They are that what we refer to as a regulatory framework. For a purchase to take place in Greece, we need 27 steps, 15 authorities, and this if things go well. And, you should pray every morning if you're conducting a transaction to go only through these steps, because you might have to go to these authorities to 5, 6, 15 times to each. So this multiplies the steps. What does all this mean? Tax. Extra tax from beyond the tax paid by citizens at the end of each year. When the state comes to me and it says that, you don't pay any taxes. Come on, when you've paid your taxes and you drive your car and you fall in a puddle, is that not something you've paid for? Or if you go to a hospital and in the end, the healthcare is actually a private sector issue, because if you give money under the table to the doctors, or if you give here and there to everyone taking care of you, you pay for it 5 or 6 times more than you would in the private sector. With the same money that we spend in Greece for all this, if we were in the States, we would live luxuriously, because the time that we spent each day is also translated into a form of tax that we pay. So what I mean is that all this has not been taken into account by macroeconomists and bankers in their equations, because they believe that we live in a perfect world. And in a perfect world, when the Troika says you need to curb the deficit by 3%, they believe that this will happen without any problem. No problem at all. But when the Troika comes and they see that we have problems, they say, oh, there are policy problems and it's your politicians who are to blame, much like happened in Argentina. But come on, think about it. How is it possible for many Argentinians, for example, to live in the States, in New York, and they live perfectly, they're law-abiding citizens, no problem at all. There is no attitude problem. There is no DNA problem. This is an easy way to say that we don't want to do anything. This is what's happening in Greece. And we marginalise people who want to do something because we say, oh, you don't know what's happening in Greek reality or in the reality of any country. If Gary and I go to countries, here in Bolivia, you don't know how things are in Bolivia. Or, you want to go and work in, shall I say, in Argentina. Oh, Argentina is a different issue. Or if you then go to Thailand and they say, you wouldn't understand how things are in Thailand. We're different. We can't understand it. What was diagnosed wrongly? Informality. The country suffers from continuous friction, so much so that the exception is the rule. To be able to buy something with 27 steps and going through 15 authorities, you will feel that you achieved a miracle. When I think about Thought for Action, which is hosting this event today, and we have 2 people working for us as volunteers, and another 2 who are going to work for us as volunteers until tomorrow. We were at the tax office until 11:30 still, because they didn't know what to do with us at the tax office. So how can we talk about a correct diagnosis if you think that Greece is this perfect little citadel in Germany where everything works perfectly? This is what was diagnosed wrongly. Informality. Informality does not mean that we are out with the law. It means that the system, by its nature, does not provide incentives to be law-abiding. You can't do it because the system changes constantly. The rules change and you can't follow it. And why? Why do we have this informality in Greece? I'll tell you. How many laws do we pass each year? One is contrary to the previous one. Or perhaps there are overlapping laws and we have to live with both of them together. For example, for taxation, we have these volumes upon volumes. We have 26 laws on taxation. How many laws do we have for accounting records? And it's been written by top lawyers and top tax consultants, but we have to, for example, today I had to ask 3, 4, 5 different tax consultants to ask them, in the end, what is the tax consultant? It's the, as they say in Spain, the tramitador. It's a specific profession that only exists in Greece. The tax technician, as they call them. And why is this? Because only in Greece do we need a technician to understand taxation. Even if we have the same sources of income, our income statement will be different each year because there will always be changes. Move on to the next slide. So we have this informality. So a couple of things. I've conducted an analysis with Thought for Action on the labour market and the real estate market, as I'm a property rights expert. So let's talk. I thought I'd talk a little bit about the real estate market. So let's start with the labour market. Informality essentially covers an entire spectrum. It might be, for example, in Sierra Leone, everything is informal. We only have very few rules. Or then we go to other end of the spectrum where we have, for example, we're in Germany or Switzerland, and it's a very formal economy. We have regulations. We don't even have to have laws. If we have rules, everyone obeys them. And then we have all the things in between in this spectrum. We have, for example, North Africa, or we have informality as we have in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, or we might have informality in the States, in the Bronx, for example. This is a typical example of the States. In Greece, we don't have the type of informality that we could talk about, for example, non-declared labour. This is both informal and illegal. It can be both. So economists, I brought two economists to work with me to measure informality in the labour market. So they said it's only 30%, it's not too much. And I said, okay, come on. The problem is that we only have everyone works and only declares half their income. And they said, oh, but we can't measure that. And I was saying, well, what good is that? That's what I need you to measure. And despite the fact that only 30% of the labour force is undeclared, so no social insurance contributions, no nothing. The cleaning lady we have at our house, when she doesn't issue a receipt, she's not insured with the insurance fund. This 30% is responsible for 65% of GDP. Imagine now that we have a much larger percentage, which is kind of semi-formal, semi-declared. Not going to ask you anything else. Just think of that. And now let's see where things stand in Greece. Let's talk about reality or attitude. When I first came back to Greece, people would say, you can't understand things in Greece. I mean, your Greek is rusty. Imagine when I worked in Bolivia and in Peru. I wouldn't be able to work at all if I had to understand the language to understand the reality. But this reality can be then presented in diagrams. What is this? This is, it's tragic. It's all the steps one has to go through to get a license to open a processing enterprise. This is a diagram that I've borrowed from Efi Stathopoulou, who's here with us today, and works with Panayotis Karkatsoulis. Because when I tried with my two economists to measure these, we couldn't. We have like 2 million laws behind this procedure. the top part concerns the establishment. Then we have the environmental impact study and approval. And I mean, just look at it. What does this mean in the following slide? It means that we have, if we take things as they should be according to law, we have 28 regulation. What's the regulation? What's the regulatory framework? It says that we have, it lasts 44 days. 44 full days if you don't do anything else, and you find all the officers and there to answer, and €1,700. But what happens in reality? It's reality is what you talk with a taxi driver when he's driving you somewhere. And he moans about what his wife had to go through to open a bakery, and she needed €4,000 and she needed this and that, or it's the same with accountants, or she has to go to accountants, she has to go to lawyers, she has to go to all these, and you have to pay them and they can do it. But this is also indirect taxation. Who has told the Troika that to open a company, to set up a company, or even a bakery, have they told them that it's actually the amount you have to pay is actually double that stated by law? Because nobody's told them, because nobody owns a bakery as an MP. But let's talk about something interesting about the Parliament, by the way. The laws that the MPs pass represent only 1/3 of the regulatory and the legislative framework, because other regulations are presidential decrees and circulars and ministerial decision and such like. So now, given that the Greeks have been entrepreneurs since the time of Homer, why did I say in the beginning that I understood and observed that the structure within which our system works is problematic and inflexible? Why? Because it has shallow and foundations and it's makeshift. And what does this mean? It means that we have borrowed a structure that worked in France and under Napoleon as regards the commercial law, and then we borrowed another part of the German legislative system on family law, and we have put Greek entrepreneurs, people who want to do business in Greece, so we've trapped them in these little boxes and they can't do anything. They're not flexible. And okay, economics is a fine finance because economics say that corruption does not exist. Corruption is just the price that you pay to get your work done or whatever. It's the motive, the fuel that your engine needs to work because you need to achieve results. Is that correct, Professor? Yes. So the countries we see that have informality, this is because they are suffocating due to the legislation and the regulations and all this legislative framework. If it's more flexible to work outside the law, you're going to do it. And I was in a cab a couple of days ago in a taxi, and I like taxis, I like them. And the taxi driver said, "It's my own taxi." And I said, "Yeah, well done, it's very clean." And I said, do you work all hours? And he said, "I can't find anyone to share it with." And he said, okay. And I said, with 26 unemployment, I can't find anyone. And he said, yes, but I need a Greek. I don't want a foreign citizen to come here. And he said, yeah, well, but the Greeks who know what they're doing, I mean, they don't want to pay social insurance contributions. Only foreigners want to or accept to pay their contributions. And if you think that you're a rational agent, as we say in economics, why would you want to share your pie? Why would you want to give more money to give to the social insurance fund? You know that if you want to go to a doctor, you're going to have to pay under the table, or you're not going to receive the healthcare service that you've paid for. You have to go to a private doctor. So there's a trade-off in which the Greeks or anyone who's kind of rational would take into account in thinking of whether one to be insured or not. So this is interesting. 45% of women are insured, and only 55% of men are insured. And what is interesting is that when we conducted this study in 2010, we saw that out of 100 employees, the ones that were insured, when we asked them, are you Greeks or are you immigrants? Most of the insured parties were Greek, and the majority of the immigrants were not insured. Now this has changed. Most of the insured employees are foreign, and the non-insured are Greeks. And this means two things. Immigrants want to be insured because this gives them some sort of legalization. And we also have, there's political reasons. We have Hrisiyavia, an extreme right-wing party, for example. And here we see that from 2006 onwards, informal work labor is on the increase, and this means that contributions to the social insurance fund decrease. Now, let's have a look at where Greece stands as regards starting business, so setting up a new company. Greece is, we see that bright orange, position 148. And I would like to show, 146, sorry. I'm not, okay, it's interesting, but I'm not entirely, I'm not so interested in the position of the country. I know that Greeks can be entrepreneurs and they have it in them, but what I want to show is, have a look at where New Zealand is. Ruth is going to talk about that. Number one. And Ruth, I want to ask her to explain how they did that. And I would also like to say that New Zealand, which is better in this ranking in the States. And I want to show that together with Greece, these countries that have problems, I mean, they're Austria and Spain, 134, 147, sorry. So it's important to see the Troika, who come and tell us what to do. Why do they not talk about informality and structural complexity? Maybe it's that they're used to that in their own countries and it's not something that crosses their mind. Let's move further down. So, where do we stand as regards informality on a global scale? We belong to the 70% of the global population, which means about 4 trillion working in informal areas in regions that are informal. Their land is not insured, their labor is not insured. Now, I'm very proud of this. I made it myself. We don't have a legal framework governing the transfer and insurance of property. We have 3 different ones that overlap and exist together. We have the 15 authorities and 27 steps here to conduct a property transaction. And what do I mean by these 3 different legislative frameworks? We have the legislative framework of notaries, the deed system, and the cadastral system and the title system, which essentially concerns the land registry. Now, in a normal economy, all these 3 should be part of the same legal framework, and we should have one regulatory route to follow. It's the only country where I can't find a single legal framework saying, for example, that you can transfer this from party A to party B. And what happens in Cephalonia, for example, it might be different to what happens in La Belloquipe here. I mean, they might be governed by different laws. You might have to go to a law dating back to 1923 or a newer one or whatever. There's no set comprehensive framework. A perfect system would be this. What we were talking about previously. Having a buyer, a seller, going to a land registry, registering the property in the records, and end of story. You go to the land registry. The land registry will have the price for the property. You can find everything there, from the price of the property, which is the selling price, to what you would be able to do with this property.
Now, this would be quite interesting for us to see that we're not alone in Europe with such a tiresome system, cumbersome system. Look at France and Belgium. For us to have a transfer and a registration of property, we rank in position 150 out of 180 countries. France is in position 146 in Belgium and 176. So don't buy a house in Belgium, you'll be in problems and trouble. Where do we have the seat of the IMF? We said in Belgium, is it? Let me remind you something else. 75% of property that must be sold or should be sold is this kind of property. Let me remind you, the economy of our country in its entirety since the year 1970 and up to the present day has been fully identified with constructions. In economics, we learn one thing. We can't have an economy which is based on one pillar alone, one productive sector, that is, let alone when this sector of production is so poorly regulated. We have so many illegal constructions and so many difficulties, and this is something that denotes that things are even more difficult to change. However, difficulty does not imply impossibility of action. So what do we need, in effect, in order to pursue a reform? First, we need upstream reforms, because when we have reforms that can have a U-turning potential. Let me explain it. Let's say that Mr. Tsipras says that when I come in power, I'll write off the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding. What does this mean? It means that any reform implemented by the IMF can be written off. No, if the reform executed touches upon the lives of all citizens. If it is a reform that needs the signature of the Minister of Finance, for instance, then we don't need Mr. Tsipras to come and annul it or cancel it altogether. It will be cancelled in its own right when we have the change of the Minister of Finance under the same government, perhaps. I think this is a notable case in point. I think you understand. Judging by your expressions, I would say you understand. So, we need a group of reformers who know things, not people who are members of political parties and they have PR skills and they have facilitated the ascent of some politicians. There is no such thing as a perfect reform country. The GB, for example, has a government reform group by the side of the Prime Minister. We don't have it. We didn't have it during the Papandreou administration, and we don't have it now. And if we have it, it is hiding very, very efficiently somewhere. No, I don't think we have such a group, a reform group. Secondly, this group of reformers need to be distant from political actions. If the political party changes, if the Prime Minister changes, they need to be there, they need to be present, they need to go on existing. And the important thing is that when you want to make a reform, you need to analyze the motives or the incentives behind it. What is it that will keep this reform going, and how is it that it should be implemented? Because something that happened very, very well in New Zealand is not automatically successfully applicable in Greece. It's like plants, for example. My mum loves plants, and when I took her with me in Latin America, she would always show me hibiscus flowers, and she said, "My God, isn't it a wonderful flower or what?" And I kept, clipping her wings all the time because I said, "You know something, Mummy? Look, if you take this flower and you take it to Greece, this will wither away. It will die on you." But she didn't hear me, and she did it, and she brought some flowers, and they died on her nevertheless. The same thing applies to reforms. The privatization of postal services may function somewhere in the world and may not have functioned somewhere else. So we need to customize, or we need to examine how things happened before we apply them. So it's very important for us to see the incentives. And last, and very important in my opinion, is to yield measurable results to citizens. And when we have these upstream reforms and every 3 or 6 months we produce results that are tactile, they are practical, sometimes we don't even bother to talk about them with the people. But as government politicians, we had better do this. We had better communicate it. With Manuel Sotomayor, who will speak in the second session, we'll speak about Peru. We talked about it before. But, people tend to forget their feelings sometimes and remember figures and numbers. They forget that there exists violence, for instance, but they remember the fact that so many people were killed. And this is a way of life, if you wish. People have learned to live like this. That about covers it. Thank you very much for listening to me.